Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Alison from the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. Today we have a very interesting workshop with Patrick Danaher, Writing an Excellent Research Design. So we are recording. It'll get posted to our YouTube channel, and I'll post a link to that. And also I encourage you to become a member of the Postgraduate Association so that we can keep all these great workshops going. So nice to see you all. That's it from me, Patrick. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you again. All right, so as Alison said, writing an excellent research design in qualitative research, and advance apologies. I realise in chatting with Alison, I've probably got too many slides, so I don't want to go too quickly through things. We'll just see how we get on, and hopefully I will leave time. Well, sorry, I will leave time for. I'll watch the clock and leave time for a bit of discussion at the end. All right, so acknowledgement of country. I try to have a different image each time. That was really interesting. I've not seen that before. Aboriginal languages on the Darling Downs. And so it's the history of Kabbalah, which is a tiny little place north of Toowoomba. I live in Toowoomba, so really interesting. So on behalf of Empowering Editing, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, including the Jagera, Jayabal and Jawa peoples of the Toowoomba region, where we are located, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. All right, so the number of topics might be a bit alarming, but it's sometimes it's only one slide per topic and so on. But I just want to start by saying the usual kind of thing, which is that research design, sometimes called methodology and method, or sometimes methodology or methods, can be very complex. And again, I'm grateful to Alison for suggesting making it just on qualitative research projects. Although, of course, the underlying principles apply really to all research. And so I guess the main thing I want to say at this stage is that this is my take on writing an excellent research design in qualitative research. As I've looked preparing these slides and so on, I've just kind of calibrated and confirmed in my own mind that there are other people who have similar kinds of things. Sometimes they present ideas in different order from me and so on. All of that's fine. So, all right. So I'll just go through those. Again, I do want to say very sincerely a huge thanks to Alison, without whom none of this would be possible. And Alison is hugely encouraging and supportive, as all of you who know who have contact with Alison. And again, just wonderful work done by the Southern Cross I have to take out University Postgraduate Association. Really excellent. And of course, to all of you, and I wish all of you well with whatever you're doing in terms of research design. All right, so these caveats are important, that there are lots of different ways that are equally legitimate, and a few of them that are not so legitimate, to research structure and write research designs. I certainly don't want in any way to undermine or contest or anything challenge the advice that you're getting from your supervisors or academics in the coursework units you might be doing. This is all part of a collegium, a collective of scholarly minds and so on. And so we're all here to learn together. And a few of the slides I used previously, many moons ago, 2011. All right, so I was previously CQU and USQ. I'm currently at Excelsior College in Sydney as a purely remote staff member. And in terms of, I don't know if it's interesting fact or not, I don't know if those of you have finished, whether you've finished your master's degree or doctoral degree or whatever, whether this applies to you for anything. In retrospect, not at the time, in retrospect, I felt that I could probably have done a little bit more with my research design chapter 4 in my PhD thesis. That really wasn't the view of the examiners or the supervisors, but it's just something that I have felt over time. I lose sleep over other things, not over that, but I just thought I'd share that. All right, so hopefully today, among other things, we'll cover this. And again, Alison's skills in putting together that kind of graphic are Oh, wonderful. So the role and value of the research design, aligning the research design with the rest of the thesis, and ensuring the research design's appropriateness. I haven't actually explicitly gone back to those 3 points, largely because of the number of slides already, but I do feel that I've done those implicitly and over a number of slides for each one of those 3 main points. All right, so I put this slide in every time, and it is worth reiterating, I think. So I would believe that we all aspire to excellent and excellence in the sense of high quality, first class, and particularly effectiveness and fitness for purpose. And so when we talk about an excellent research design, it's not meant to be said or written in a competitive sense, but more, does it fulfill its purpose? Does it do the job? So I just examined a PhD thesis fairly recently, and just because it's still in my memory. And so that did an excellent job. That particular thesis research design did fulfill that requirement. Its research design and the rest of it, this research design was certainly fit for purpose and highly effective. All right, now, I know I come back to this. Those of you who've been to previous, I recognize a few faces of names, apart from Alison or in addition to Alison. And if you've come to any of the previous workshops, I put this up every time, but to me, it is the centerpiece. So all of in this case, the decisions that you make about your research design keep coming back to this. It's your thesis, it's your study, it's your call about what the research design is. And what that means really is that there's nothing predetermined. You could, and I say this to some of my students, and it might drive them crazy, I don't know, but I say to them that they could choose, maybe 5 or 6, or maybe, I don't know, 66, but certainly they could choose a number of different research designs. They could choose only one, but from a number of options, and they can make any of those research designs work for them and fit for purpose and so on. And therefore, nothing's predetermined or preset. It's more an ongoing set of decisions about how do I make this work. And so this scholarly voice might be elusive, and well, it often is elusive and slippery, akin to a mirage in the desert, but you will get there. And you may well be there already, which is terrific. All right. Okay, so let's get into what's in a name. And what I mean by that is what's in a name in relation to research design, methodology, and method or methods. And so I'll come back to that. I have a particular preference, but that's just a personal preference. So, okay, Leedy defines research design as a plan for a study, providing the overall framework for collecting, and I've added, and analyzing data. Macmillan and Schumacher say it's a plan for selecting subjects, presumably participants, research sites and data collection, and I would add again data analysis procedures to answer the research questions. And for Durkheim, is a strategic framework for action that serves as a bridge between research questions and the execution or implementation of the research strategy. Now, what I tend in my own thesis, and what I encourage other people to do, but that's all it is, I use the term research design as, if you like, the overarching bridge between the conceptual framework and actually reporting your results or findings or answering your research questions. All right, so that's when I think of that particular space in the thesis, for me, that's the research design. And I'll explain why in a moment. But you and your supervisors might not use the term research design at all, and that's perfectly okay. When I was examining the thesis a couple of weeks ago, I can't remember now what it was called, but if it were called instead the methodology, I would immediately understand what that meant. Okay, so there are some translations going on, but this is a personal preference, not, I think, hopefully because I just don't like the word methodology, but rather because they have other meanings in my view. Okay, so Schwant, some of you might know, does really excellent work philosophically around interpretivism and constructivism and so on. He defines research methodology as a theory of how an inquiry should proceed. So as we know, in terms of the derivation of the word methodology, it's the study of methods. And so I tend to think of it in that way. So I, I certainly don't avoid using the term methodology, but when I use it to refer to the underlying philosophy of research methods or the collection of methods or something like that. I'm sure we all remember from biology the classificatory system where you've got, and I can't remember the order now, but phylum and family and species and so on. To me, this is a bit like that. So to me, methodology and method are at different levels of the classification, and research design is at a different level again. Okay, so methodologies do all of these kinds of things. So they work jolly hard, but that's how I tend to think about methodology. Now, again, people, if sometimes the way through the forest or the wood or whatever metaphor you want to use is to work backwards. And so I'm sure that you've come across these and lots of others. So phenomenology and ethnography, the UWA has got a very good website, which is in my references list if you want to look it up later. But as well as that, we've got action research, autoethnography, biography, case study, grounded theory, historical study, narrative inquiry, phenomenography. I should have added self-study and lots of others. There are lots of others. Now, there's nothing inherently qualitative about any of those, except that qualitative researchers do tend to use these kinds of approaches, shall we call them. Now, some people would look at that list and would call it methods. Okay, and I've done that myself in the past. Some people would look at that list, UWA looks at this list and calls these methodologies. So they talk about the action research methodology, the case study methodology, and so on. My personal preference is the case study method, the grounded theory method, the narrative inquiry method. But that's just I guess, because I've got maybe a kind of traditional mind and I like to have things in their place, as it were. Other people might see those as artificial distinctions that don't actually have a great deal of meaning, or, they're just part of the cultural capital of certain people, scholars who specialize in research methods or methodology, and that's fine. So really the only requirement is that if you're going to be using one or maybe more of those for your study, to be clear and consistent about what you call it or what you call them and why you use that term. So if we contrast that list with this list, so again from UWA, interviews, surveys, focus groups, I thought about taking experiments out in terms of this workshop, observational studies, online data collection. And again, there are lots of others. There are archives, there are Delphi study where you work with experts in a field, there are documents, there are researcher journals to record their feelings and to contribute to their reflexivity, which we'll come to. So again, if almost like working backwards, if you think about that, to me, it is important to distinguish between this list and the previous list of case study and grounded theory and ethnography and so on. To me, they belong to different orders of things. Now, you might disagree, which is absolutely fine. But for me, this is, as it says there from UWA, these are the specific approach to collecting your data. And it is true, mostly this is about data collection rather than data analysis, which I'll come to. Okay, so I would call these techniques, but some people would call the previous list methodology, and they would call these methods. So the Delphi study method, the interview method, the focus group method, and so on. So I don't want to seem as though I'm absolutely fixated on this, but I do encourage you, and you, of course, this may be all very obvious and familiar to you, but if not, I would certainly encourage you to continue to think through how you understand this particular class of phenomena and what you call it and why you call it that. So what's in a name is actually quite important. Now, excuse me, I've used this slide previously, but with different colors highlighted. So previously it was about the conceptual framework and so on. And again, people might have different lists, which is absolutely fine. But for me, this is my best bet at the almost like a generic structure for a thesis, particularly a qualitative thesis. So it's in now, they might be in different orders and that kind of thing. They might be called different things, but I would like to know what the focus of the inquiry is, whether that's research questions, research hypotheses, research problems, whatever. Some kind of situation, situating the study through the literature review, some kind of conceptualizing or theorizing the study, conceptual framework or research framework, theoretical framework. And then for me, and again, when I say and then, I've seen studies with different orders, particularly these first 2, 3, and 4. But at some point, the research design or the methods, the methodology. Okay, so how will data be collected and analysed in order to answer the research question, or to in order respond to the research hypotheses? Now, strictly speaking, data collection, data analysis are a separate process from the research design that we're talking about today, but clearly they're interlinked. And so that's why I've highlighted all three of them. Again, some of you might be working in post-positivist spaces or post-structuralist or postmodernist or whatever, and see even the term data as being quite conventional or old-fashioned or whatever, and absolutely fine. I certainly would accept that point. And even the word evidence might not be used. It might other kinds of ways of, so it might be representation or whatever. And I think that's really interesting work. But I do think at some point there needs to be some some representation of how these kinds of decisions are made. And I do see this as a bridge between the early part of the thesis and the later part where you present the answers to the research questions and or you respond to the hypotheses, and then ending with some kind of confident assertions about contributing to different knowledge types. Again, I've used this table before. The only person because I've anonymized them, the only one I now remember without looking them up is myself. So I'm H. But if we look about the research design chapter in these 8, actually 7, because E didn't have a research design or methodology chapter, which is interesting in itself. But for the others, in terms of the percentage, what's that? This was the biggest one, 16.5%, down to me, just over 9.75%. Maybe that's why I'm a bit disappointed with that chapter, as proportionately the lowest of all of these. It still served its purpose, but so that's an indication in terms of the research design chapter as a proportion of the total word count. All right, so in yes, so in one slide, what I've done there is to try. So when I'm supervising or re-examining a thesis, and I think about the research design chapter, these are the kinds of things that in my head, particularly a qualitative study, in my head that I'm expecting to read. Now, there might not all be there. There might be other things there. They might well be in a different order, but these are the things that I've elaborated in the next several slides. The biographically situated researcher, which I'll come to in a moment, is a really interesting one, whether people actually name it in that way or don't. Excuse me. Sometimes that's actually in chapter 1, almost in the first section of chapter 1, because it's so crucial to the positioning of the researcher in relation to the thesis. Sometimes if it's in this chapter, it might actually be at the end or towards the end. But actually thinking about it, I think that so many decisions are made about this, which we'll come to, that for the purposes of this workshop, I've put it as the first item in the chapter that I would be expecting to read in some form or other. Now, if you choose not to go down the path of the biographically situated researcher and researcher positionality and so on, that's fine. It's making that decision. If that's the case, then obviously this would not be here. Now, this sequence, again, you might have things in a different sequence and so on, which is fine. But I do encourage people to think about the research paradigm or paradigms. Now, I realize that one of the claims of post-positivism, yes, and post-qualitative research and post-structuralism and so on is that they actually go beyond paradigms. And again, paradigm might seem quite old-fashioned and so on. And I accept that critique. But for me, one of the benefits of that is that it actually encourages people to write, to think and to write about these ologies that do cause people to lose sleep sometimes. So ontology, epistemology, methodology, and axiology, for instance. Now, someone might counter and say, well, you can still do those without a research paradigm. And of course, that's absolutely fine. But we'll come to examples soon of what, when I talk about research paradigm, what I'm thinking of. Now, you might look at those and you might say, oh, I recognize that. I might even say I'm using that, but I don't call it a research paradigm. I call it something else. That's fine. That's great. Now, the next one is what I call the research orientation, whether that's qualitative and or quantitative or mixed methods. Now, some people, I've seen this quite frequently, talk about the qualitative paradigm and the quantitative paradigm. And, you know, I can accept people using that term. I prefer not to use that term because I think if people use that term, they might actually forget about these other examples of paradigm that I'll come to. So it might seem I'm fixated on language and vocabulary and so on. It's not so much that, it's really giving space for what I see as a large number of quite complex puzzle pieces in this particular chapter. And so if you can make a naming decision that means that you still attend to qualitative and or quantitative, but that you, as well as that, you look at these other elements, then I think that's a good thing. In terms of sequencing, for me, the research paradigm is perhaps the most deeply philosophical. And again, people might say, throw up their hands in horror and say, what on earth are you talking about? But it's because of this, particularly because of ontology, epistemology, and axiology, that I make that claim. And so for me, it just makes sense that that is here. Now, qualitative, in this case for today, obviously has philosophical dimensions as well and theoretical dimensions. But it also has pragmatic, operational, functional kinds of dimensions. And so for me, it just makes sense to position it here rather than before the consideration of the research paradigm. But again, it's up to you. Now, I do think, particularly if you're using what we were talking about before, something at the level of case study, action research, discourse analysis, grounded theory, phenomenology, phenomenography, and so on. That's where I would put that or those. Now, again, you could write a thesis without any of those. Absolutely. You could go straight from these to this, data collection and analysis, and that's fine. It's just that most people I've worked with have had something here, which almost like a bridge within the bridge, as it were, because they've used, whether it's action research or whatever it might be, philosophically consistent and consonant with the paradigm and the orientation, but also operationalizing the research, particularly for data collection, but sometimes for data analysis. So discourse analysis, for instance, is brilliant at data analysis as well as data collection. And then getting into the data collection and analysis and what that looks like. Sorry, I should have corrected that. I changed that early this morning to research rigor because credibility is almost a subset of rigor, but we'll come to that. And then I do think, whatever you call it, research ethics, sometimes people, I've put it in brackets, but research ethics and politics because that encourages people to think about what are the political dimensions of this study, and how does power operate, and whose interests are served by the research and by what we're looking at, and so on. And then sometimes people put axiology in there. All right, so this is not meant to confuse people. It is actually meant to illustrate what I think is a really important point, but again, you may well be aware of this important point. I worked with Eileen Furlonger many moons ago when I first moved to USQ. I was teaching the research methods unit, and I had the first assignment was called the researcher you are is the person you are, discuss. That kind of traditional wording. And Eileen, there were a number of others who did great work, but I really liked what Eileen did, including this representation. So really, it's not so much the individual points here, it's more the point that what before is a serial list, it's a linear, it has a linear logic to it. What Eileen has done here is to show that actually it's a really complex, multifaceted, multiply intersecting approach to researcher decision making in relation to all of this. And so, the person you are determines through life history and so on, but also links with epistemology, ontology, informs the person you are, informs the researcher you are, and that's impacted on again by epistemology and ontology, and that determines or frames or influences the research questions, the paradigm, the methods, the techniques, and so on, plus these other elements as well. So I really like the way that she's set that out. One of the things that you might do already is in the thesis, if that's what you're doing at the moment, you might have something similar to this that examiners would find really interesting, because it makes explicit that none of this is predetermined, none of this is preset, and actually most of this is not easy. Maybe none of it is easy. It's complex. You have to make complex decisions all the way through. And so this more dynamic approach to research design is really important, I think. And then she's elaborated that, and we'll get into that in a moment. So for her, this is what she was working on in terms of paradigm. So positivist, interpretivist, or constructivist, or naturalist, I know those are not necessarily synonymous. There are distinctions between them, but in some ways they're more similar than say these others. So critical theory and post-structuralism and so on. And so I just really like the way in one diagram, Eileen has set all of this out. And again, it's moving from the philosophical, theoretical to the more functional, operational. How does this work in this particular research project, and so on? But also, all of these are meant to be interlinked. Sometimes when we're hearing about people's research, we think, oh, there's a bit of a disjuncture there. It's supposed to be, I don't know, it's supposed to be post-positivist, but it's using wholly qualitative methods, and the data analysis is really focused on teasing out more qualitative themes, for instance, rather than something that post-positivism, or certainly positivism, might be more interested in, such as variables and so on. So mapping your research in this kind of way, I think, is really important as well. Okay, so just very quickly. So to mention or not to mention, a bit like Faulty Towers and the war, don't mention the war. Some qualitative researchers absolutely say this is de rigueur. You can't get away from this. Of course, the researcher is biographically situated, and so it's really important to elaborate that and articulate that and so on. And I've got a couple of terms that might be useful there. Some people say, for whatever reason, their own experiences, or they might feel the field has gone too far down the track of autoethnography and self-study. And, I certainly read critiques that say that's self-indulgent, and it's more about me than it is about the research and so on. So obviously we need to guard against all of that, but that's a question for you. And then if you do go down the path of mentioning the biographically situated researcher, as you may well be familiar with this notion of positionality. This article that I came across last night, putting this together, is quite an interesting study, and I've referenced it in the reference list at the end of the slides. But I think it's got some really useful notions there around positionality and around ontology and epistemology and human nature and agency that are worth looking at. So if you are writing about the biographically situated researcher, almost certainly you'll need to refer to positionality, whether you use that term or not. And then the other term, so positionality, locating the researcher about 3 areas. And so these are very practical kinds of questions, but also the notion of reflexivity. And fundamentally, reflexivity informs positionality. And so reflexivity is probably the best guard against the charge of self-indulgence, that it isn't, you haven't just written the thesis the night before or anything like that, and it's some kind of stream of consciousness thing that you just want to get out into the world. It's actually really rigorous, very systematic. You've shared it with other people, including your supervisors and so on. And so it does fulfill that key requirement of research rigor. All right, so again, not wanting to go through in detail, but this is a composite. I didn't put this together, but the references are there. This is a composite of different paradigms in relation to ontology, epistemology, theoretical perspective, methodology, and techniques and instruments. And so, you may well be working with a different paradigm from what's in this slide and the next slide, which is great. You may well contest these assertions about the epistemological dimension of positivism or the ontological assumptions about pragmatism or whatever. It's really a starting point for you to look at, or not necessarily you, but for people to look at and to say, well, does this make sense? Does this gel with my understanding of what I'm doing here and why I'm doing it and so on? I think that I certainly think this is really complex material. I really admire scholars who spend years, decades of their lives researching this. It's hard work. It's really fundamental philosophy. And so it's good that people are generous and share their insights and so on. And then 3 other paradigms: subjectivism, critical theory, critical realism, and so on. So again, it's just trying to make these connections. Now, you might think, well, discourse theory, for instance, I'm interested in, but I would use that with a different kind of, discourse theory aligned with a critical theory or whatever. Absolutely, these things are not meant to sit only in these little boxes, even though that's the way it's set out. Okay, so a slightly different approach. So 4 paradigms here: post-positivism, positivism, constructivism or interpretivism, while recognizing they're not synonymous, critical theory, and post-structuralism. I think this is useful because it goes back to the fundamental purpose: to measure, compare, and predict, to understand, to change and improve, to deconstruct, potentially to reconstruct. And then what does that look like in terms of representative research questions? And more importantly, what does that look like in terms of helping to influence and shape your research questions and the form of your research questions and so on? All right, so we go from that deeply philosophical, but really, and really important sets of ideas to still philosophical and still theoretical, but also practical and operational and functional. And so I'm sure you're very familiar with this kind of thing. When I teach this to research master students at my college, I make the point that while this kind of table is useful, almost any of those, maybe except the words and numbers, sorry, I might have, sorry, many of these can be questions and so on. Sorry, I've just realized I've copied the wrong column over. I do apologize for that. So if we think about it, so quantitative research would have supposedly many respondents, and then qualitative would say few respondents. closed-ended or multiple choice questions for quantitative or qualitative, open questions, and so on. The focus, we might say quantitative research, many people say that is theory testing, and qualitative research people often say is theory building. However, I say to my students, almost any of those can be challenged and contested. And there comes a point at which they're almost stereotypical in order to point out differences. And I think the important point about that is that quantitative and qualitative research, despite getting into research orientation, or sometimes called research paradigm wars, both are still very useful potentially for you in your research. They have a different look and feel, and they have somewhat different purposes and effects, but in some ways it's easier to think of them a bit like in the next slide, where in terms of a continuum. And so again, if we look at this, quantitative is deductive, qualitative is inductive. Well, you can still do qualitative research that's deductive, in the sense that it's theory testing. So you might have developed a theory, or you might have selected one that other people have used, and you want to apply it to a new context and so on. So probably you would see that as deductive, but it's still qualitative. So really what I'm trying to say here is that it's not so much how we use these terms, but how in general, in theory, in principle, but how they might be useful for you. So again, in terms of if your study is qualitative, just looking at this continuum, how close is it to these kinds of things: theory building, holistic inquiry, context specific, and so on, narrative description? So it may well have those, but it might actually be using a statistical analysis for qualitative purposes, which would be absolutely fine. Okay, so back to research method or methodologies and so on. So if we look at those, as I said before, you could well have a research design chapter in your thesis where you'd actually leave this section out, where you don't have those. But as I also said, most of the people I've worked with have used one or occasionally two of these. And they've used that for really particular kinds of purposes. And one of those is actually because the people who've come along before them have done some of the heavy lifting for them. So for instance, I've worked with a couple of people in narrative inquiry. If you're familiar with narrative inquiry, it has a very particular approach. So it has a small number of participants, it might be 3 or 4 or 5 participants. And typically each person goes through a co-constructed narrative, a form of semi-structured interview with the researcher. And sometimes that might be for 3 times, or sometimes 4 times. Now, the point about that is, among other things, really pragmatically and strategically, the pioneers of narrative inquiry have done a lot of the work already, particularly around justifying that as an appropriately rigorous method or methodology, whatever you call it. And so you do not have to go through that part of the hard work. You can say, you cite Clandinin and whoever else in terms of narrative inquiry, and the examiners recognize that as a kind of shorthand, and they say, aha, okay, fair enough, yes, the student has done their homework, they know what they're talking about. Similarly with phenomenography, about the the number of qualitatively different concept space and so on that people come up with, and constructions or conceptions. Sorry, it's conceptions. And so again, a lot of that work has been done beforehand. In terms of grounded theory, the debate between Glasser and Strauss and other people who've come along afterwards, whether that's classical grounded theory or a more contemporary approach to that. And they're different in fundamental ways. They're still grounded theory, but they're different kinds of grounded theory. All right, so obviously I've just got one slide here, but for that section of the chapter, if you do have it, it's explaining a little bit about the history of ethnography or whatever, and more importantly about how you're using it, but also how you recognize, like any of those, like anything in life, has limitations, and so you acknowledge those limitations, and how have you engaged with those, and so on. So if, depending on what name you use for these methods or techniques, again, it's how do you collect the data, how do you collect the evidence, whatever terms you use, but how have you done that? And so often that includes participant selection and so on, whether that's some kind of sampling process that you've gone through, all of that kind of thing. If it's relevant, if it's appropriate, saturation, whether you've gone through that, and whether you've experienced that. And so that's one indication that you've collected enough data using that method or technique, and so on. If you're using, if you say autoethnography or self-study, the researcher journal can be really important with regard to positionality and reflexivity to make the work transparent and explicit and open to scrutiny and critique, and so on, and to enhance its rigor. All right. So data analysis. Now, again, there are different approaches here, and I've just put some of them down. Categories and codes, content analysis, discourse analysis, interpretive phenomenological analysis, narrative analysis, positioning theory, thematic analysis, and there are lots of others. And so again, some people may not have that. They might approach this differently from that. But this is familiar to students and supervisors and examiners. And really importantly, when you do that, or if you do this, it's really vital to make sure that you include specific examples of where whatever you've got, categories, codes, patterns, themes, and no doubt there are lots of other names, where do they come from? And so it's, as an examiner, I really like it when the student has given examples of how they went through the process, and example codes, let's say, and how they have gone through a process of they're the initial codes, but they've gone through a process of reviewing those codes, and often it's data reduction. And so people, typically qualitative research, as we know, you might generate 122, which are great, but not very practical. And so then it's a process of going back and reducing the number, but not in a random way. It's making explicit the logic of doing that, and also confirming that those are codes. And sometimes that's through comparing with supervisors and that kind of thing. All right, so I'm sorry if that's not really clear, and it's just one example, but I liked it because it made the point in terms of structures and decision making. Again, research question, data collection, within that, what does that look like? Working with the data, in this case, textual data, and so they've got a particular approach of categories and coding and so on. All right, relating and creating the association between the categories. And that for these people were, well, this person was in relation to creating a model. And then the synthesis and making sense of the data. You know when something is rushed, when this part is left out, when you might have this and you think, oh, really interesting. Those themes, let's say, or codes or whatever, very fruitful and lively, and maybe using lively metaphors and that kind of thing. But if this part is missing, you think, well, there's a missing link, almost, so what? Where does that fit in? What's the significance of that? All right. And then checking for new ideas until saturation, or some process of checking back, of looping back to make sure that this is all integrated and so on. Okay, conscious of the time. Now, research rigor. Now, as we know, in qualitative research, there are some people who would say, oh, validity and reliability, you can't possibly do that. They're different things. It's not about, there are other ways, rather, of ensuring that what you're looking at is what you're looking at, what you found, kind of thing. Validity, the idea that what you sought to analyze is what you're actually analyzing. And reliability, which of course is complex and so on, but really about if other people came along and looked at your data, they would generate the same findings or similar findings. Or if you came along and did the research in a year's time or 5 years' time, that you would have similar findings. Now, I don't want to misrepresent that notion, but in saying that, it helps to explain why for a lot of qualitative research, that doesn't make any sense. In fact, it would be really concerning if someone else came along and looked at my data and analyzed them and found the same findings as myself. I would think that's a bit odd. I would hope that they would actually come up with different interpretations. And that's part of the, when databases are shared, and we're getting more into that these days, that's part of the excitement. What will they find? Using different lenses and so on, and their own experiential knowledge, what will they come up with that's different? So this is old but true, or whatever the saying is. Lincoln and Goober, or sometimes Goober and Lincoln, different reference, but a number of people use these: credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And again, if you want to use those, that's fine. Some people say that's a little bit old-fashioned now, and so these are some others looking through this morning that I came across: authenticity, member checking, naturalistic generalization, reflexivity, relevance, resonance, significance, transparency, triangulation, trustworthiness. And again, there are lots of others, but the key point there is that it should have some kind of meaning beyond me as the researcher. That's the point, that this makes it a public good, that it goes beyond something that I would do as a private benefit. And then I think almost at the end, so in terms of the research ethics and politics, really important, adhering to both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And it is important, obviously, we have these national codes of conduct and ethical research and so on, absolutely, and that's the letter of the law. Also important is the spirit of the law, almost like what is our disposition in relation to our relationships with participants and other stakeholders, including end users of the research. Really important. So some quick thought-provoking questions. Cui bono? Who benefits from the research and whose interest is the research? Clearly myself, almost always it's going to be the researcher front and center, but hopefully other people, maybe through reciprocity. So one of the questions for the researcher is, how can the research benefit participants and other researchers? What might that look like? Is that feeding information back? Is that contributing to future collaborations? What does that look like? Whose interests are progressed and or hindered by the research? Who has a stake in particular findings? And then what's the relationship? I think this is a really interesting one. What's the relationship between the research and the exercise and effects of power? For instance, contributing to different forms of capital, cultural capital, social capital, and so on, and also contributing to dominant discourses and or the thesis as a counter narrative to that dominant discourse. And what does that look like? Okay, and these are some approaches to ethics that I think are really interesting. I've used situated ethics for quite some time. My holiday reading is proximity ethics. So Martin Buber and Emmanuel Levinas and some of those people, I, thou. I'm just fascinated by that. And, fundamentally, philosophically, the relationship between self and other. And what does that look like? Okay, I don't want to minimize it by going quickly, but I encourage you all. But wait, there's more. Final one for this year, writing an excellent qualitative journal article on the 5th of December. Now the references, a little bit about empowering editing. So I'll just stop sharing. Thanks, Alison.
Well, thanks. That was awesome. I really like your diagrams. They're going to be really useful for students. That was it Furlonger, the one?
Yes.
Paradigms, methods, and yeah. It's almost like print that out and stick it above your desk.
That's right.
And remind yourselves what you're doing. So we've got a few minutes left, and over to the students, really, if you'd like to ask Patrick anything or clarify something he said, you can use the chat or your microphone.
Thank you. Good morning, Pratik.
Good morning.
Thank you for this informative session. Actually, I'm a new student at Southern Cross University, and I'm doing just a graduate diploma. It's a lot of information for me and a lot of new things for me. So I'm just wondering the research paradigm, like this topic, like ontology and epistemology. Can you please just a little bit explain for me?
Oh, you're on mute,
Oh,
Patrick.
sorry.
There you go.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thanks, Alison. Thanks very much. That's a great question. Can I just ask what discipline or what your study is in?
Before I finished my Master of Education from Bangladesh,
Mm-hmm.
and now I start the graduate diploma of early childhood education at.
Okay, all right. So I thank you for that. And the reason I asked that question is that, as you say, those are big terms, epistemology, ontology, and so on. And so one of the ways to think about them is in relation to your field of, expertise and so on. So education, early childhood education. And so one of the ways of thinking about that is in relation to the young children you work with and you may be researching with and so on, or researching about. And that is, how do they understand? How do they gain knowledge? Obviously, epistemology, and also what is the world for them? More ontology. What is the nature of the world? And what is the nature of their relationship with the world? And so, one of the big debates in ontology is whether, and obviously it's both of these things, but we have an external world, that exists independently of us, but we experience the world through ourselves. And so ontology is partly about that relationship between ourselves and the external world. And so you would know far better than I do with young children how they develop an understanding. And I guess it's moving beyond the egocentric stage, that I'm not the center of the universe or of the world. And how do they come to understand that, and what do they do with that understanding? And then epistemology is what the knowledge is that they have about that. So that's very quickly, but
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, how's everyone else traveling? Okay, Matt's nodding. Okay. Because we do have a range of disciplines here today, and also quite a range of courses like honours, masters, and PhDs, which is great to see.
That's right, Alison, and that's interesting, isn't it? A lot of the people, in all those disciplines, social work, health, and so on. I know in health there is a lot of really interesting literature around ontology, epistemology, and different paradigms, and so on. And appropriately, it comes from practice, as it does in education. It comes from really complex questions about practice with clients or patients or whatever we call them, the people we work with in our different professions. So yeah, that's interesting.
Okay.
Oh, hey Patrick, I got a question. It's about which qualitative, I'm going to get the word wrong here, methodologies can produce theory. So of course, grounded theory, that's something that comes out of that. I'm looking at other ones, maybe just that aren't quite so burdensome or restrictive, but I'm interested in getting theory, something a bit more generalizable rather than just an evaluation of whatever I'm looking at.
Yes. Thanks, Matt. Great question. I have the view that any of those, whatever, as you say, whatever we call them, the ologies or the odds or whatever, any of them can contribute to theory building, because I think the fundamental question is, as you say, if you look at a program and you evaluate it and, hopefully it works fundamentally, but there are some things that didn't work or whatever, and of course, the fundamental question about that is, why is that so? Or why was that so? And then that question, so if you're using, in a sense, I guess, say if you're using, I don't know, narrative inquiry or, in one sense, it's a tool. So narrative inquiry obviously is using co-constructed stories, narratives, to get inside people's experiences and so on. But you still have to ask the question, how does the person make significance from that or make meaning from that? And how can other people reading that narrative make sense of it and connect with it and that kind of thing? And so I think fundamentally then there are questions around, say, the person I worked with recently on that was about teacher educators and changes to their identities through changes to teaching, you know, over a long period of time. And of course, some of it was wailing and gnashing of teeth and lamentation, and it wasn't like the good old days and all of that kind of thing, but it was more about the recognizing the huge stresses that teachers and of course nurses and social workers and so on are under, and was trying to make sense of these great big global forces and how do they impact on those fields of practice. And so part of the theory building for Yvonne, who looked at that, was, so where does teacher education and indeed teaching, where do they fit in these global changes, you know, in terms of changes of identity, changes of self, changes of notions of citizenship and the purposes of formal education. So I think I've no doubt you'll still be able to do that almost regardless. So therefore, it's probably better. So Yvonne loves stories. So that's really the reason she chose narrative inquiry. You know, so choosing it for reasons of personal interest is absolutely fine, I think, because you'll still get there.
And thank you so much. And that's actually more relevant than you know, because I'm looking at identity as a potential kind of guiding question with my thing. And it's to do with education, psychedelic therapist education, but education nonetheless. But because I'm in the field of psychology, which is traditionally quantitative driven, and I don't think it's as credible, and like I know I don't subscribe to it, but given that that's the case, out of the qualitative options, are there some that are more credible to people who are quantitative leaning and can still generate theory?
That's a great question. I have worked with qualitative psychologists as researchers and so on, and my immediate response to that, Matt, is stories, narratives, that they respond to that, partly because, as you know better than I do, whether it's in counseling or whatever, it's about how does the client represent, you know, how do they tell stories to represent, say, their own identity or the world, or if there are things that are stressing them. So narrative is a form of communication and representation of underlying experience. You know, that's one response anyway. But of course, you and your supervisors will be making sure your examiners, if they are psychologists, they're open to that. You know, that's a fundamental point. Otherwise, I don't know, sending an atheist tract to a rabid Presbyterian or whatever, you know. I'm not picking on Presbyterianism. My grandfather was one of those, but you know the point. So some people have their own views, but they're still, and this is the point, as supervisors and examiners, they're open to what the student does with whatever methodology, what paradigm that they're using, and that's the really interesting thing, you know.
Great, thank you. That's so useful. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. We just hit midday, or in New South Wales at least. Any last comments or questions before we wrap up? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for your attendance. I hope to see you. Thanks, Shobna. Thanks for your comment there. Hope to see you on Thursday, the 5th of December. If you want to see Patrick again, that'll be awesome. Otherwise, I'll finish the recording there. So thanks so much for your attendance today.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.